The Spirit has a word for each of us today, and with God's help, we're listening. So today marks the week in our journey through Matthew that we move from Jesus' parables about the kingdom of heaven to action. Put your money where your mouth is, Jesus. Now, the thing to remember about when we hear in the Gospels stories of what Jesus actually did, in some ways they too are parables. They're the stories his earliest followers told about what it was like to be in the presence of Christ. Now, like parables that sometimes are best told with the caveat, I don't know if it happened this way or not, but it's true. We probably shouldn't get too hung up on the details or the mechanisms by which these miracles happened, and trust that those who experienced the miracle are telling a true story. At this point in Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, things have gotten a little hectic. He's attracted crowds. By the day, more and more people sought what he could offer: healing, forgiveness, compassion, welcome, and a meal. He hadn't only attracted the notice of the people of those days, but also that of the authorities. And in fact, the story in Matthew's Gospel just before this one reminds us of what happens when the authorities aren't thrilled with what you do. You see, Jesus had just gotten the news that his beloved cousin, the one who had baptized him, had been executed by the state for treason. And when King Herod asked who this Jesus was, he suspected that Jesus might be John the Baptist himself come back for revenge. And so maybe, despite the excitement he had generated among the crowds, he felt a little nervous, a little scared, a little curious about where this journey was going to take him. And so he tried to get away, like so many of us do. I just need some quiet time by myself to figure things out. And yet, his message, his presence, what he had to offer was so compelling that the crowds followed him even into that deserted space. They followed him into his loneliness. At that point, Jesus saw them and had compassion on them. And instead of taking the time he thought he so very much needed to recoup, to reflect, to refocus, he did what Jesus does best, and he offered healing and forgiveness and welcome. Now, the disciples at the time probably too were a little bit nervous about this person they had given everything to follow. And when the night got late and they'd been at it all day long, they said, Jesus, these people are hungry. We have nothing left to give. Send them for something to eat. And Jesus says, no, you give them something to eat. But Jesus, we don't have anything left. but these 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, that'll be enough. We've got this. And so we know the story, the miracle feeding of the 5,000. 5,000 were fed, not counting the women and children. Maybe it was 10,000, maybe it was 15,000. Regardless, 5 loaves and 2 fish offered by those who thought they had nothing was sufficient for the crowds. There are so many times where I, and maybe you, have felt that way. I just need some time alone to reflect, to refocus, to refigure. And yet, in that very moment is when we are called to do just a little bit more, to open our eyes, to look around, and to have compassion. There are times when we feel like the disciples that we have given our best, we have given our all, we have nothing left, and yet we are called to share. And in the sharing, what we have becomes enough. Now today we are in our 87th day of April, July, August. And maybe some of us are feeling a little bit exhausted. Maybe us are yearning for a crowd of people with which to share a meal. Maybe we don't know that we have anything left to give. And so this message, this story that the earliest disciples told about what it was like to be in the presence of Christ is a story for us too. It is a story that says we are enough. That in the presence of Christ we are looked upon with compassion and offered healing. And that, my friends, is communion. Being seen, being heard, being loved, being forgiven is at the essence of what our communion meal celebrates. And so whether or not we are in a crowd, we are alone, we are with our families, wherever we find ourselves, we are part of that crowd on that day in a desolate place, doing the best we can with what we have. Sharing God's grace with one another. We will once again celebrate communion in person. And until that time, let us be in awe of how truly big God's table is. It spans time and space. God's table is whatever table we find ourselves at today. We are all welcome. We will all be fed. And in fact, there will be plenty left over. Amen.